Good morning, and thank you for joining me on the path to liberty. I'm Michael Bolden with the 10th Amendment Center, and this is the show for Wednesday, May 11th, 2022. And I often get people who ask me for recommendations of articles or books that are a good introduction to the principles that I talk about, but very introductory, just some base core principles. Like, how did you go through this? I don't hide the fact that I used to proudly proclaim that I was a Marxist or a commie or a socialist. And clearly my views today are far, far different than they were as I was growing up being, propagandized in government schools. So what are the things that I learned from? So on this episode, I want to go back to an old article from 2003 by the late Harry Browne. Many of you may have never even heard his name, but a lot of his writing and his radio show back in the day, they were very influential on my thought. And this article, The Seven Never to Be Forgotten Principles of Government, had a big impact on my thinking early on. So I want to go through those 7 core principles that are essential to remember about politics and government, but also kind of go back and forth between the views that Harry wrote and tie it into views that I learned from the founders and old revolutionaries that are actually quite similar. But first of all, before getting to that, I want to say thank you. Thank you so much for being here. I really appreciate you spending some time with me today, whether this is your first episode or you've been here for every single one since day one. I am going to say a quick hello to everyone out in the live chat while we allow people another moment or so to get notifications and join us on the live stream. But I first should mention that as I go through this episode and every single episode, as I mention stuff, articles, original source documents, quotes, stuff like that, if you want to find those and read them in more detail, in context, on your own time, I include them in the show links section on the individual blog post for every single episode that I publish 1 to 2 hours after the live stream is done over at 10thamendmentcenter.com/path to liberty. Again, 10thamendmentcenter.com/path to liberty. And hello to everyone in the chat. Let's see. There's Gunai in Missouri, I think. Dixie Strong in Alabama. Tim Martin in Arizona. Patricia Dance. Brian in Georgia. Sharon Patriot. Poet Fisherman in Iowa. God's Green in Texas. That Liberty Gal, Liberty Revolutionary, good to see you, buddy. GTA2 SW City from Nevada, California. Who else? Senator DT in Elkhart. Lawrence Smith in West Virginia. Yes, man, finally made it. That's awesome. Appreciate you being here on the live show. Kirk Morrison in South Carolina. And everyone else. Liberty Gal says, I'm so disappointed I missed seeing Mike Meharry when he was here in DFW. Yeah, I think he did actually 3 different events, one at the Bastiat Institute, and I'm not even sure about the other ones, but he's been sending messages saying that so far everything went great for his trip there. Anyways, let's get right to this. Again, the show homepage, 10thamendmentcenter.com/path to liberty, all spelled out. That's where you're going to find all the stuff that I reference. And I first should mention, again, I started out as kind of a commie. I grew up in a government-run school. I was taught that the solution to all problems were government were propagandized from birth through death. Every moment, every time there's a problem, we're told by various people, unless you're one of the lucky ones, that government is the solution to all of our problems. And it's never government that caused the problems in the first place. It's somebody else, some greedy corporation or some bad guy, whatever. And government's there to protect us, whether it's domestically or around the entire globe. And so I was still mostly dumb and ignorant in my thought process back in 2003, and certainly even after that and before as well, even worse. And I would look at, but there was something that I always recognized that there was a problem. I would look at Team Red and Team Blue, and I didn't really see much of a difference. Today I would say I was partly right and partly wrong there. I think on the wrong part, many times the individual policy goals can be very different on many issues. Now, when it comes to printing money and the empire and things like that, it generally doesn't vary much. It depends on which team is in power sometimes. But I think the underlying strategy where I was right, where there was just an instinct that these guys are all a problem, was that most of the time, in most issues, they wanted to use the power of the central government, whether it was through the courts or through a constitutional amendment or through the power of the executive branch or through legislation. They just wanted to force their view on the entire country. And I think even in those areas where one side or the other takes a different approach on one issue or another, the general view is the goal is always to get everyone on their side. It's never to live and let people be their own way in their own area. And then I came across this guy, Harry Browne. And I read this article, and I want to start out with his 5th point. This is the one that really struck out to me. And it was that power will always be misused. Harry Browne writes, "Give good people the power to do good, and that power eventually will be in the hands of bad people to do bad." I never heard that from anyone ever. Not in my upbringing, not in school, not anywhere. I always thought that, well, government is the good guys. We're the land of the free. We're protecting the world, making the world safe for democracy and all that other garbage propaganda they give us. And people who work for government are always heroes and they're protecting us and blah, blah, blah. I never thought of, well, even if they are all amazing today, eventually some bad people are going to have that same power. And we don't want to leave it to future generations to have to fight off the power that we created today. That's just nasty to me. And Harry goes on, he says, as Michael Cloud has pointed out, the problem isn't the abuse of power, it's the power to abuse. Give politicians power, and it certainly will be abused eventually, he writes, if not by today's politicians, then by their successors. And that's, again, from the 2003 article, The 7 Never-to-be-Forgotten Principles of Government. Years later, I realized that message right there, give them the power to do something good today, and eventually they'll have the power to do something bad, is very similar to what George Washington warned about in his farewell address of 1796, originally drafted by James Madison, modified by Hamilton, both under the direction of Washington himself. And here's one line that I think sums up that view pretty well. He says, let there be no change by usurpation. He said, if you don't like how the Constitution is structured, there's a process there to change that. But don't just usurp power. Don't just get government to do stuff you like because you like it. He said, let there be no change by usurpation, for though this, in one instance, may be the instrument of good, it is the customary weapon by which free governments are destroyed. So Washington had that same view. Give them the power to do stuff you like today. And eventually, this is not just a bad strategy. It's actually used as a weapon by tyrants to destroy liberty. And that's a pretty powerful warning that I got from Harry. I actually learned it from Harry first and then move forward. Anyways, the next principle, we'll go through these in order now. The next one is that government is force. You have to think about this, that government, at the end of every regulation, law, rule, order, whatever it may be, there is the barrel of a gun, and they are willing to use force and violence to make you comply. Now, they don't always have the person power to do that, but that's a different episode. And Harry writes, every government program, law, or regulation is a demand that someone do what he doesn't want to do, refrain from doing what he does want to do, or pay for something he doesn't want to pay for. And those demands are backed up by police with guns. Agents, you could have FDA agents, ATF, DEA, local police, whatever it may be, but it's always about force. And I've recently been covering on this show a bunch of the anti-federalist papers. And for example, this was a big concern, the idea of having to use force to get people to do your way. And they were concerned that the larger the government, the more centralized the power, the more that it would have to rely on force rather than voluntary support. For example, in his 4th paper, the anti-federalist writer Brutus argued that a government can only rule in one of 2 ways. You only have 2 options, either the support of the people or by force and violence. I covered that in an episode last year, No Representation, Anti-Federalist Brutus number 4, that I will link to in the show notes at 10thamendmentcenter.com/path-to-liberty. And then another episode, I've got a bunch of stuff on this, but these 2 I thought were really good. In Cato's 3rd anti-federalist paper, he actually warned specifically that the more centralized the government is in, now Washington, the more centralized, the more that it will have to rely on force to get its way. Because if you have a one-size-fits-all solution among 2 people, the worst you're going to have is one person that you have to use force on. Maybe you're going to be much luckier and have 2. Now, this wasn't his argument. This is my rudimentary. But when you have hundreds of millions of people. You're going to have all kinds of different political, economic, religious, social viewpoints. And having one view for everybody only guarantees that you're going to have to force it on a large portion of the population. We talk about political polarization today. Polarization, as George Washington warned in that farewell address, you should read it in full because it's got some really amazing warnings, is what leads to what he called a frightful and permanent despotism. Anyways, this third paper that Cato wrote, Consolidation Leads to Force, is another good episode for you to check out as well. Back to Harry Browne's article. The next one is that government is politics. This is another never-to-be-forgotten principle about government, that government, all government actions are politics. He says when you turn over the government to a financial, social, medical, military, or commercial matter, it's automatically transformed into a political issue. And we see everything is politicized today because government is so centralized. And when government's actions, their regulations and things like that affect so many people, then of course the people who take one side or another on an issue, they want to control that centralized power to force their way on everybody. And it's kind of a self-replicating problem that gets worse and worse and worse over time. And again, that's what Washington warned about. Harry Browne goes on, he says, politicians don't weigh their votes on the basis of ideology or social good, and we can see this all around us. A lot of times I would think, at first I was reading this again and I'm thinking, yeah, they're just different ideologies than I have. But so many times we see politicians and their grassroots supporters and their corporate backers and whatever, they'll take two sides of the same issue depending on whether or not it's their team, their guy, their girl doing what we're talking about. They love it when their people do it, and then they all of a sudden come up with some reason why, well, this time it's different. But really, the core issue is the exact same thing. So they don't actually have an ideology. So many people have none. They just have adherence to their faction. And this is how a lot of the general public thinks. Harry writes, they think in terms of political power. And we always have to remember that government is power, government is force, government is violence, government is politics, of course. And here's James Madison in his speech in a Virginia convention in 1829. He was old at this point, but his principles were still strong. He said, the essence of government is power, and power lodged as it must be in human hands will ever be liable to abuse. Next up, Harry says you don't control government. That's the next never-to-be-forgotten principles. You will never control government. Even if you could come up with the perfect law to do exactly what you want, he says, your ideal law will be written by politicians for political purposes, administered by bureaucrats for political purposes, and adjudicated by judges appointed for political purposes. So don't be surprised if the new law turns out to do exactly the opposite of what you thought you were supporting. This is exactly what we get all the time. The Patriot Act, of course, was never about patriotism. The Affordable Care Act was never about making healthcare more affordable. All these things for your security when they tell us that they're protecting us. It's generally so they can control you. So what they're doing and what they're claiming is often the opposite. And sometimes even when they're doing something that you may like, it really ends up getting twisted down the line because it ends up in other people's hands. Richard Henry Lee wrote something very similar to his nephew in 1791, Thomas Lee Shippen. He said, politics is the science of fraud, and politicians are the professors of this science. They want us to follow the science these days, of course, as they've always wanted us to follow this particular science, this science of fraud. Back to Harry again, he said, every government program will be more expensive and more expansive than anything you had in mind when you proposed it. So whatever you started out with today, even if you think it's just, for example, the income tax is just going to be on the richest of the rich, it'll be a temporary wartime measure. The Patriot Act would just be used for the terrorists. Things like that, they always end up getting expanded over time because, as politicians do, they will always look at the law in front of them and find different ways to use it, to twist it, to expand their own power. Harry said the new program you support will eventually include all sorts of powers and privileges you can't even imagine right now. Again, give good people the power to do good today, and eventually bad people will have that power to do bad in the future. And there are so many founders and old revolutionaries who warned about the nature of power. Of course, I already cited James Madison. Here's Abigail Adams in a letter to John Adams in November of 1775. She said, "Power, whether vested in many or a few, is ever grasping." And I know a lot of people who follow us always cite Lord Acton, power corrupts and absolute power corrupts absolutely. But certainly we have to recognize that between zero and absolute corruption, power always has to continue growing and growing and growing until it gets to that point of absolute corruption. And Abigail, I think, summed it up perfectly. No matter how many people have power and no matter how much power you give them, it will always seek to expand. People with power don't ever want to give it up. Almost never. I mean, once in a while we'll get one. And of course, the next one from Harry Browne is government doesn't work. It just doesn't work. Because government is, I think he wrote a book titled Government Doesn't Work as well, which is really good stuff too. He said, because government is force, because government programs are designed to enrich the politically powerful, because you can't control government and make it do what's right, because every new government program soon wanders from its original purpose, and because politicians eventually misuse the power you give them, it is inevitable that no government program, none, will deliver on the promises the politicians make for it. None. Zero. And he used to do this challenge on his radio show, and after he passed away, I remember I would go back and I found some of the archives and I listened to them over and over and over again. But he did this kind of a weekly challenge. Hey, people call in, back when you would do things like that, call in and give me a program that you think that works. And he would actually refute how, maybe even if you think it's working in the long run, this is how maybe they could use it or misuse it in the future. And this one later on made me think of Thomas Paine in Common Sense, which of course was first published in January of 1776. They promise us all this stuff. This is what Harry's saying. They promise all this stuff. They screw it up, and then we have to be reminded that they're forcing us to pay for all of that screw up, all those lies as well. Here's how Thomas Paine put it. When we suffer or are exposed to the same miseries by a government, which we might expect in a country without government, our calamity is heightened by reflecting that we furnish the means by which we suffer. We furnish the means by which we suffer. The next point from Harry Browne is that government must be subject to absolute limits. Because of all these other issues that he listed out, you have to have absolute, not kind of just wiggle room type of limits, but absolute specific ones. He said, because politicians have every incentive to expand government, and with it their own power, there must be absolute limits on government. And that's how Samuel Adams put it in 1780 with John Adams and a number of others. He said that power without any restraint is tyranny. That's how Samuel Adams, the father of the American Revolution, defined tyranny as government that didn't have limits. And as soon as you have a little leeway, that means they're going to have a little leeway more and more and more and more. So a single step, as Thomas Jefferson put it, beyond the limits of the Constitution is to take a boundless field of power. Just to take one step beyond the limits is unlimited power. To Samuel Adams, that was a tyranny. And then back to Harry, he said the Constitution provides the obvious limits. So he's saying, look, we need to have limits. The Constitution is that set of limits. He said we must reimpose them on the federal government, Until the Constitution is enforced, we have no hope of containing the federal government. And he was right. This is 2003. And of course, who would have thought that the government in 2003 was small in any way? We would have thought of it as a monstrosity if we had the views that we have today. But people who didn't like the size and scope of the federal government weren't saying, well, it's big, but it's not all that bad. But in comparison to today, you can look back on those times or in the 1990s and say, in comparison, that was tiny. I'd go back to 2003 and have a much smaller size and scope of federal power than it is today. It's far worse because it just keeps getting worse and worse and worse. And what's the worst today? Well, in 20 years, it's probably going to be far more dangerous. So the obvious limits that we have are the Constitution. And here's Jefferson again. In questions of power, let no more be heard of confidence in man. Don't trust humans to do the right thing, but bind him down from mischief by the chains of the Constitution. Now, Jefferson, of course, we should know this, and maybe if you're kind of new to our work here, you may be thinking, well, just wrap him up in the Constitution. No. Jefferson isn't saying use the Constitution to bind them down, use the limits of the Constitution to bind them down. And for Jefferson, when government goes beyond those limits, a nullification of the act is the rightful remedy. Side note, back to Harry Browne, he said the present system of unlimited power, and that's how he referred to it. Because if government can do what it wants and it can define the limits of its own power, that power is unlimited. And that's what Samuel Adams was talking about in 1780 as well. The present system of unlimited power is like giving a drunken stranger a set of signed blank checks on your bank account. You are reduced to relying on the honesty and integrity of people you don't even know, and they abuse that trust again and again. That's a really good analogy to me. Giving people access to your bank account and say, you need help here, write yourself no more than $10 checks. Withdraw $20 here and there as you need it. You have to trust that they're going to do the right thing. You don't know them, so how can you actually trust them? Would you trust your neighbor to do that? A family friend? Probably not. But why should we trust politicians with power over our lives and liberty and our futures, really, in any way? I wouldn't trust these people for anything. As old Abraham White put it in the Massachusetts Ratifying Convention, this one just kind of popped in my head. I didn't actually think of it for the show notes here. But he said, I wouldn't trust a flock of Moseses. I wouldn't trust 1,000 Moseses with power, because you don't trust anyone with power. He was pretty emphatic, and that had a lot of impact there in Massachusetts. But here's the Patrick Henry version, and I've been covering Patrick Henry's great anti-federalist speeches. There's a couple of them that I've done so far. But here's how Patrick Henry put it. Show me that age and country where the rights and liberties of the people were placed on the sole chance of their rulers being good men without a consequent loss of liberty. He called it a mad attempt. Every time you trust people with power to do the right thing, or trust people to just, they're going to be good, they're going to be okay, they're not going to violate my rights, I like the dude in charge today, I like the Second Amendment president, or I like this person, and then not end up with a loss of liberty. He said, you're just dumb. This is a mad attempt. And these 7 never-to-be-forgotten principles of government, we work really hard every single day to share this kind of message with more and more people. There is nothing that helps us reach and teach people about the Constitution and liberty and how to defend both when the government refuses to, which is 24 hours a day, every second of our lives. Nothing helps us do that work more than the financial faith and support of our members. If you haven't joined us yet, you can do so for as little as $2 a month over at 10thamendmentcenter.com/members. Again, 10thamendmentcenter.com/members. I do want to check out the live chat and see if there's any questions or comments I can get back to. Don't forget to smash the like button, leave a review on Apple Podcasts or any other podcast platform, leaving comments in the archive. These types of things will help trigger the algorithm, tell those platforms to show us to more people, and it does help out a great deal. Poet Fisherman, this is a great comment. I shudder to think of the power this government will be wielding in 20 years. For me, that's why sometimes I like reading. Of course, I do so much work reading, studying, looking over, reviewing the wisdom and advice of the founding generation, the old revolutionaries even before the founding generation. But I think it's also important to read wisdom and philosophy from people in more modern times. Here's Harry. I think he died, somewhere in the early 2000s. And he wrote a lot of great stuff about the Constitution and liberty at that time. And he was talking about how government was massive at that time. And if we look back, it's almost shameful that that actually looks to be a much smaller government than it is today. So to think about what it'll be like in 20 years if we don't have a quick change of course, it's either going to collapse on its own or it's going to be a much worse tyranny. Samuel Adams, I will always say I love that screen name. Act in local government systems. Do not consent. Of course, the idea is we want to advance individual liberty. That's the end goal. You want to create a system where the rights of the individual have the greatest chance of flourishing. And as long as there are going to be governments, the best place to do that is the closest you can get to the individual. Sharon Patriot says self-imposed misery sounds absolutely horrid. Yes, I'm not sure what that was in response to, but I think a lot of what we do today, the general public is begging for more and more tyranny. And maybe that's not exactly what you were getting at, Sharon, but I see that happen all the time. Hunter's F over on Twitch. I appreciate you being here on Twitch. Good afternoon as well. Seeing what else. Funding an undeclared war at taxpayers' expense is an abuse of power without a doubt. Most of what the federal government spends money on is a violation of the Constitution. Almost nothing that do to today is authorized under the original legal meaning of the Constitution. And if we blindly tried to nullify everything, maybe we'd be wrong 5 or 10% of the time. But if you're going to college or you're in school and you get 90% right, they say you're an A student. So you're pretty awesome. So we don't even have to think about whether or not stuff is constitutional if we want to be a little lazy about it and just reject all of it. And we're going to be right most of the time. I'm pretty happy with that. Patricia Dance has got a very important point. People think as long as it's their side, all will be well. And I was stuck in that viewpoint for so many years. And that's why I think Harry Browne's article stuck out to me. I had problems with both the major teams. I just didn't like them. But I thought it was okay, if my view was different than both of them, that it was okay to try to get the right people in power and force their way on everybody. Get the right Supreme Court justices and force my way on everybody. But when I read that from Harry and I first started hearing this idea that as soon as you give them the power to do stuff you like, even in your own lifetime, it may not be generations in the future, eventually people are going to have that same power. And will you be able to control them? No. They don't work. Oh, you work for us, I pay taxes, is one of the dumbest things I hear people say. They do not. These are rulers. They are ruling over us, and we are a population on our knees, begging for permission, begging for control as often as we can. Liberty revolutionary government is the enemy of humanity. I knew I was going to open up the conversation to stuff like that with this one today. Exponential growth of despotism, he writes as well. Just scrolling back and see if there's any other comments. And the Fed from Bonehead 88. Certainly the tool that funds all this government power certainly has to be dealt with. But I don't know if we're going to get government to end its own funding mechanism. We, the people, have to come up with ways to make it irrelevant. I'm not sure what that is, but absolutely. No question about it. Says always record police. Yeah, you can't trust government. DHS is a monopoly. Disband it. And again, I'd like to see the DEA, the ATF, the DHS, the TSA, and virtually every other government agency. Maybe there's a few we can keep around, and then smarter people can figure things out in the future that I don't know how to deal with. But I'd like to see them all gone. But I just don't see them ever getting disbanded, because a disband action either requires some kind of action by the executive branch or Congress voting to end their own programs. And these people will never do this. So we have to find, again, strategy like Jefferson, Madison, and so many other founders told us to resist them and nullify them into oblivion. And it's not going to be easy. As Jefferson said, 1790-ish, he said, we're not going to be translated from despotism, the largest government in history today, to liberty. We're not going to be translated from despotism to liberty in a featherbed. Again, I really appreciate you being here. Oh, y'all should read Anatomy of the State, said Jordan. Absolutely. That's another good one. We're talking about more introductory. That's a little deeper reading, but I do appreciate that recommendation as well. But I think Harry Browne's article is an excellent starting point. I couldn't actually find it on his website. The website is still up, run by his family, but I did not find the list of articles that I used to find, so I went to archive.org, and I will include that link so you can read and share it, and it should probably be there forever, at least through our lifetime. So I really appreciate you spending some of your time with me today. Thank you so much for being here. I hope you enjoyed the episode. I hope it made you think. I hope you learned something. Thanks again. I'll see you next time here on the Path to Liberty.